Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today, we've reached the last episode in this run about the great political fictions. I will be coming back with more soon. But next time, we're taking a break to talk about the ideas behind UK general elections. For the last novel in this sequence, I'm going to be talking about, perhaps appropriately, perhaps not, one of the classics of dystopian fiction, Margaret Atwood's unforgettable The Handmaid's Tale. It is a truly terrifying book. Is it also a prophetic one? Like many works of dystopian fiction, The Handmaid's Tale is set in an unspecified future. It was published in 1985, and it describes a future America. America has turned into an awful patriarchal society called Gilead. But we're not told exactly when, and we're not told exactly how. Some works of dystopian fiction are very specific about when they're set. For example, one that I've already talked about in this series, H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, where we're told, bizarrely, because it's a long way in the future, that it's set in the year 802,701. We don't get a date in The Handmaid's Tale, at least not a date about the main events being described. Some dystopian fictions are deliberately vague. The point is not to have the reader speculating about when exactly this is and how exactly did we get there. All the reader needs to know is that something has happened and everything has changed. Perhaps the most haunting dystopian fiction of the 21st century, Cormac McCarthy's The Road, is that kind of book. So in The Road, we're not told how America becomes a nightmarish, cannibalistic society. We just know that something has happened. And actually, all we're told in that book, in just one sentence, is that, I quote, there was a long sheer of light on the horizon and then a series of low percussions. That's it. That's all it takes to spell the end of everything. Is it a nuclear accident? Is it nuclear war? Is it something else? That is just the event horizon of the story. Everything else happens in its own time, its own world. But The Handmaid's Tale, though it doesn't give us a date, is actually historically a very specific kind of book. There are lots of reference points that allow the reader to place it, and we're given a lot of clues, actually, as to chronology and sequence, and where to place this story in time relative to when it was written, 1985. There is also a chapter at the end, an afterword, which is dated. So the book ends with a future, that is a historical description by a future academic at some bizarre parodied future academic conference, trying to understand the origins of Gilead society. What is this document that we've been reading? What does it tell us about the world it describes? And with that, we're given a very specific date. The academic conference happens on June the 25th, 2195. So it's 200-ish years in the future, where a bunch of pompous academics are trying to understand what is this story that we've been reading. And in that final chapter, that afterward, we are given actually quite a lot of clues as to what has been going on that turned America into Gilead. But in the main body of the novel, the story of Offred as told by Offred, the lead character, her smuggled memoir, this is a document that is secretly composed in order to describe the horror of her life for people who need to know what has happened to America. In that part of the text, we're also given quite a few clues as to when and how to place this story. And there's one in the middle which is very specific and actually does allow one to say when the action of A Handmaid's Tale is meant to take place. In the middle of the story, Offred is remembering her childhood, and she spends quite a lot of time remembering things from the time before America became Gilead. She remembers from her childhood a TV program that she saw when she was young about the Holocaust. We're told explicitly this was a documentary that she watched about the time when the Jews were killed in death camps in ovens. That's what she remembers. So we know this is a documentary about something that happened between 1941 and 1945. And the documentary is an interview with a woman, we are told, describing those events with the hindsight of 40 or 50 years. So it's sort of 40, 45 years later. an old woman, who was the mistress, the lover of one of the commanders of a death camp. And Offred remembers seeing an interview with this old woman who is brittle and poised and groomed and is still 40 years on trying to hold together her justification for having been complicit in horror. And that's why she remembers it, a woman trying to justify her complicity in the horror of a man, because she is the lover of a man who is killing people on an industrial scale. And clearly in this documentary, she is being asked by her interviewers 40 years later to justify herself. And Offred remembers the justification being that it wasn't her business to inquire into what he got up to. It was her business to comfort him at night. This was clearly a man with a difficult and terrible job. And it's reminiscent a little of the film that just came out this year, The Zone of Interest, about the women behind the men who did the killing. And this woman in this documentary says, it wasn't for me to question what he was doing. It was for me to comfort him. But Offred remembers a couple of other things about the documentary. One is that at the end of that program, when she saw it as a child, it finishes with a caption that says, a few weeks after the recording of this interview, the subject of the interview committed suicide. So this woman, whoever she was, held it together in a poised but brittle way for 40 years, and then she broke. In the end, she broke. The other thing that Offred remembers is that she was young enough when she saw this documentary to be confused and to think, because it was about people being killed in ovens, and she then associated ovens with baking and cooking, she somehow got it into her head that the Nazis had eaten the Jews. They'd baked them, they'd cooked them, they'd eaten them, which, if nothing else, tells us that she must have been a pretty young child. A teenager's not going to think that. So we can say that 40 years after the Holocaust, which would take us to roughly 1985, the year that The Handmaid's Tale was published, Offred, the lead character, was maybe 7 or 8 years old. And we are also told that Offred, when the book is being written, the events that are being described in real time, is in her late 30s, 37 or 38 years old. And we know this in part because she is a handmaid. Her job is to become pregnant and to produce a child who will be raised by another woman in a society where fertility has become the most prized thing, but also the source of oppression. And so she knows that time is running out for her. And that dates the action of the book. 40 years on from the Holocaust takes us to 1985, and 30 years on from 1985 takes us to 2015. That is when this book is set. It is set roughly 30 years ahead of the date that it was published, which means when it was published, this is a futuristic account. But for us already in 2024, this is a future, an imagined future that is past. 30 years ahead for Margaret Atwood is now 10 years behind for us. But the other thing to say about 2015 in this book, as seen from 1985, is that it's a future, but it is not a futuristic future. Nothing, almost nothing about Gilead, the world described in The Handmaid's Tale, is like a sci-fi version of the future. It's almost all made up of elements from the past, some of it from the distant past. This is a retro future. Gilead is a society which is anchored in the past. It's a before 1985 set after 1985. And all sorts of different elements, quite historically specific elements, go to make up this society. It's an amalgam of things that have already happened. Some of it goes back to the founding of the United States, to its origins. It is set, we are told, in this future, the academic conference where the dry as dust academics are trying to piece together what is this document that they found. And they conclude that it is happening in Maine, in a town called Bangor in Maine, in New England, in the northeastern United States. And it clearly echoes a centuries-old version of American life, Puritanism, the Puritan origins of some aspects of American society, the hierarchy, the patriarchy, the repression, the biblical literalism. Even the costumes have a Puritan feel to them. It also echoes pre-Civil War America. It echoes a society that was once founded on slavery. Because in Gilead, women try to escape. They are effectively enslaved for reproduction. and they try to escape. And escaping from Gilead, as escaping from the American South before the Civil War, meant trying to move north to get out. And Atwood describes the means of escape as what she calls the underground female road. Women smuggled out, smuggled north. In this case, not from the southern to the northern states, but from the north of the United States, from Gilead to Canada. Canada is the way out. And then from Canada, if you're lucky, over to Britain, across the ocean. We are told that at the time of Gilead, the future, 2015, but also weirdly the past, there are in Britain, in England, free the women societies. Societies of people who are trying to emancipate the women who are trapped in Gilead and to get them out, to rescue them, just as there were anti-slavery societies in Britain in the first half of the 19th century, and movements to try and emancipate slaves from the horror of the world in which they were trapped. This is a 17th century, an 18th century, a 19th century world. It's also made up of elements of the more recent past, that is, the more recent past as seen from 1985. Some of them American, some of them not American. It echoes in part what was happening in American politics in the early 1980s, which was the beginning of the great politicization of abortion and the politics of reproduction, and the new religiosity of American political life, the moral majority so-called, the new wave of evangelical Christianity sweeping the politics of the right. This is all happening just before the time that Atwood is writing, and then projected forward to a future in which it might have become something much, much more extreme. But a lot of it comes from outside America. And we are told this again in that final chapter, in that afterword, where the academics are trying to reconstruct what are the sources and the origins of Gilead politics. We are also told about an academic paper that tries to compare two theocracies of this period, the period being sometime between 1985 and 2015, Gilead and Iran. And Iran, in this case, is the one that Atwood already knows about. 6 years before the publication of The Handmaid's Tale was the Iranian Revolution. And the Iranian Revolution saw a society which was not liberal by any means, but in which women had a range of opportunities, educational, social, in employment, and also in public appearance, how women were able to dress in pre-revolutionary Iran, disappear almost overnight, following what was effectively a kind of coup d'etat, which created a new kind of theocratic politics that turned women's lives and women's life opportunities on their head. The implication being, this can happen very quickly. It might in the United States seem impossible that a society based on American freedoms could turn into this kind of repressive theocracy overnight. But we are being reminded it happens in other places, and it's happened very, very recently. Since the publication of The Handmaid's Tale, you can tell similar stories about other places. Afghanistan is another. Atwood, in that final chapter, also references something that happened in Romania in the early 1980s, under the dictatorship of Ceausescu and his so-called scientist wife, Elena Ceausescu, which was a panic about fertility, about reproduction, the thought that Romanian women, for whatever reason, were not having enough children. And the state outlawed abortion and tried to control fertility and reproduction. There was a new, massively repressive move to try to take charge of what seemed like a trend towards dropping below the replacement rate in terms of human reproduction. This had already happened somewhere in Romania in the early 1980s. The Handmaid's Tale is also full of references clearly to things that were known about how societies functioned behind the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union. In Gilead, the women often encounter spotty-faced, pale, young men with guns at checkpoints or guarding the wall. There is, in Gilead, a wall, and the wall is where traitors are hung after execution. The bodies are hung. But these places are guarded by young men, potentially trigger-happy young men with guns, but who look to the women like they should still be in school. This is Checkpoint Charlie. This is the Berlin Wall. These things were policed by young men with guns who looked like maybe they should still be in school. Atwood's also thinking of a society like the 1980s Soviet Union, where an ideology is starting to break down. People don't really believe in it anymore, including the people whose job it is to uphold it at the top of that society. And so this is a place with grotesque double standards at work. The people in charge in Gilead, the commanders, the men, the powerful men, are projecting an ideology which is an ideology of repression and of puritanism and of morality and of pleasurelessness. And yet they are leading lives secretly, which are nothing like that. They have their own clubs and codes and ways of being when nobody is watching, which are the old ways of pleasure and the old ways of living, which they cannot allow anyone to see in public. There is another world for the elite, which is hidden away but is known about. Everyone, in a sense, understands that this is a society shot through with double standards, and yet no one can articulate it. This is all happening in 1985. Not all of it in America by any means, but it's all happening somewhere. One of the things that The Handmaid's Tale reminds me of, and I don't know if this is deliberate or not, is another work, not of dystopian fiction, not even of dystopian science fiction, but of dystopian science from a couple of decades earlier, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which was published in 1962, which helped to initiate the environmental movement. And Silent Spring describes a kind of dystopian America, a nightmarish America. That's how it begins. It describes a land that has been ravaged by pesticides, in which the crops have failed, in which children are dying in the streets, in which disease is rife, in which birds are falling out of the sky. This is clearly not 1960s America, because 1960s America wasn't that place. And yet Rachel Carson says when she was writing Silent Spring, what she wanted to do was take things that had happened somewhere, not all of them in America by any means, but had happened somewhere, and imagine a world in which they were all happening in the same place at the same time. And that's what Gilead is. Gilead is a coming together of all of these different things, which on their own are not necessarily sufficient to create this nightmare, but which together produce it. But that then raises the question of what brought them all together? So how do you get from 1980s America to an America 30 years later, which is almost unrecognizable, which has in it elements of the past that many people believed were long past 17th, 18th, 19th century forms of repression? A society which has rejected the future, which has turned its back on everything that counted as enlightened progress to try to recreate something that was thought to have gone. How do you get there? Because it's not enough to say that these forces were at work. Something has to bring them together. And again, we're given lots of clues as to what happened. And towards the end of the book, we're given a more explicit pseudo-academic account of how Gilead was created. And there are three things that go to turn America into Gilead: demography, race, and religion. And these three things have to come together. Demography is the fact of women having fewer children. Some of that, as described in The Handmaid's Tale, is the thing that was already happening in many Western societies in the 1980s, thanks to female education and emancipation and employment, and all of the forces that went to produce a society of choice in which, by no means all, by no means the majority, but enough women were choosing not to have children. And it was already creating the elements of a panic. But it has to be more than that, because that is a trend, but it's not enough to turn America into Gilead. And so Atwood suggests something else has happened too, something more dramatic. And this is a bit more like Cormac McCarthy's The Road. We're not told what that thing is, but it's like in Silent Spring, a combination of things that were happening in different places and different parts of the world. It includes the effect of pesticides and of chemicals in the environment, which might have had a catastrophic effect on human fertility and reproduction. It includes what are described as atomic events and accidents, fallout from breakdowns at nuclear power plants, something that was also happening in the late 70s and the early 80s. There is the suggestion of chemical warfare and of biological warfare. Gilead exists in a country and a world at war. in a state of almost permanent war, in which clearly things are being used that potentially could have a catastrophic effect on the ability of human beings to reproduce. So this is a story which, in the classic Ernest Hemingway formulation, is happening both gradually and then suddenly. There were trends at work in this society that are massively accelerated by an unspecified event or series of events, with the result that what looked like a slow trend towards falling below the replacement level for the survival of the human species is rapidly accelerated to a panic. The number of babies, we're not told how many, falls below a level that anyone thinks is sustainable. This is the grounds of the panic that creates the conditions for Gilead. But it's also about race, because we are told as well at the end of the book by the academics that this was a problem of Caucasian societies. And this is also, therefore, not just the fear of falling below the replacement level, but the fear of the great replacement, something that is familiar from contemporary politics. The idea that white people are not reproducing fast enough and they will be overtaken by those people who are still having children. And therefore, this is a society in which a group of white people have asserted their ability first to secure the conditions of reproduction, and second, to exclude the non-white races. So we're also told that Gilead is a society that has moved non-white people out and moved the Jews out as well. There's another echo here of the earlier 20th century. The Jews are expelled. They are sent away. This is a white Christian nation. And it is also a Christian nation. So for this to happen, demography has to be accelerated by an event. This event has to touch on fears of racial replacement. And then there has to be an ideological basis, an ideology available for the people who want to take over to use as their tool in order to justify what they do. And the ideology happens to be a kind of biblical literalism. I don't think Atwood is saying that biblical literalism or evangelical Christianity lead to Gilead. I think she's saying it the other way around. If you're going to create a Gilead, you need an ideology. It's not just enough to say people aren't having enough babies. And by people, of course, this means women. You have to be able to create a rule book which bases this in some much, much wider and more far-reaching moral code. And the rule book happens to exist. It exists in the form of literal-minded evangelical Christianity. And that is the basis of this takeover. But this takeover is effectively a kind of Leninist coup. It's another coup. There's a group called the Sons of Jacob that we are told at the end of the book were plotting a takeover of this kind. And they achieve it, we're not told how, in such a way that they then roll out this playbook based on their ideology, based on their fears. It's brutal, it's repressive, it is extraordinarily violent, and it is very quick. Because the other thing that the chronology of the book makes clear is this doesn't happen between 1985 and 2015. It happens much closer to this imagined 2015 because Offred's memories are memories of the time before. And it's not just when she was a young child. It's when she was a student. It's when she was in her 20s. She was living the other kind of life, for want of a better phrase, the life when there were choices about how to live. She has a child in that life. She has a child with a man with whom she is not married in that life. That child is taken away from her when Gilead becomes Gilead. But this all happens in the very, very recent past relative to the world that she is describing. This happens gradually and then suddenly, and the sudden event is maybe 5 years or barely more than 5 years before what is being described. So this has to be ready to go. You can't create a society like Gilead by experimenting and seeing what evolves. Whoever these people are who took this thing over, these paranoid white supremacist men, like the Leninists, they had a plan ready to go and they roll it out with brutal, ruthless efficiency. And so it creates a world, Gilead, which is in so many ways made up of an amalgam of all of these other things accelerated by whatever this series of events was that made this possible. It's all familiar, and yet it is completely uniquely itself. There is nowhere like Gilead. Margaret Atwood has created a world which is unforgettable, but it is unforgettably itself. To read this book is to be taken to a place that doesn't exist, but once read about, never forgotten. Partly because the imagery and the symbolism is so clear, and the things that are familiar are defamiliarized in the way that Margaret Atwood specifically describes through the memoirs of Offred, exactly how this society works. So, for instance, it is a society in which women are the oppressed class, but as with many oppressed classes, within that class there is a very rigid hierarchy, a whole series of ranks. And the ranks are described in detail. There are the wives, there are the handmaids, there are the aunts, there are the Marthas, there are the econo-wives. The wives are at the top, the wives who are the wives of the commanders, the men in charge. These wives will raise the children, but these wives will often not themselves be able to have children because the ability, the capacity to have children is now rare. Offred's problem is that she has had a child, so she is thought to be capable of childbearing. The wives are at the top. The handmaids serve the wives. Their job is to produce children who will be raised by the wives. The aunts police this society. They are essentially the tools of repression. The Marthas do the domestic labor in this society. So the handmaids are not expected themselves to do domestic work. They simply exist for one purpose, which is to produce children. And the econo-wives, the people at the bottom of the social pyramid, are the ones who still have to do it all, have to try and both make a living and exist in the world and also have and raise children. That is to be at the bottom of the ladder, the ones who are expected to combine both labor, paid labor, and the functions of reproduction in this society. And this hierarchy is familiar from other social settings. It's almost medieval, and yet it's not like anything else you've ever read about. It has within it another feature of these kinds of hierarchies, which is within it, there are these very, very rigid divisions between the women at different levels, and there is also complicity across those different levels. It is both a world of repression and secrecy and fear, and also a world in which everybody is constantly feeling out among the people above them and below them in the hierarchy. Can these people be trusted? Is it possible to have a real conversation? Above, below, and at the same level, handmaid to handmaid. Can you trust the handmaid that you go for a walk with? If you even hint that you're not sure this is the way to live, is this a way to find someone with whom you can communicate, or is it to sign your own death warrant? The rituals of this world are unforgettably described. Again, they have echoes of the familiar, and they are completely unfamiliar. The ritual of, and there's no other word for it, insemination, when Offred has to have sex with her commander, it is a highly ceremonial affair. It is public, it is not private. There is no pleasure involved. This is functional. It is to try and produce a child. But it's also profoundly hierarchical. Again, it's medieval. It's like a medieval court where when the king has sex with a woman, this is a ceremonial event because it might produce an heir. But in this case, it cannot be with his wife because his wife is not capable of producing an heir. And yet this child has to be the child of his wife because the hierarchy depends on it. And so what you get is a description of the sexual act in which a man has sex with a woman, and that woman lies, as the book says, with her head on the pelvic bone of the woman who will raise the child. One woman lying with her legs open behind another woman who rests her head on that woman's pelvic bone, and the second woman is being penetrated by the man. Once read, never forgotten. The book also defamiliarizes the things that come from the past. At one point, Offred says of her own life that she is a refugee from the past. So in the words of another very different kind of novel, L.P. Hartley's The Go-Between, its famous opening line, "The past is another country. They do things differently there." And certainly in the world of Gilead, the past is another country. America is another country. They did things differently there. But Offred lived in America. That was her country. And she's a refugee because she didn't just travel out of it in time. She was forcibly removed from it. She was expelled from her past into a future in which she feels like she is an exile from her own life. And then she is given glimpses and hints of what used to exist before. There is contraband in this future world, contraband from the past. At one point, she is asked illicitly and also complicitly to join the commander in his room, in his study. This is not allowed. She is meant to have no relationship with this man outside of the act of putative insemination. And yet it's clear to her that this man wants something more from her. He wants whatever it is he is not getting from his wife. She suspects when he says, "Come to my study tonight," that he's going to make some outlandish, outrageous, perhaps even disgusting sexual demand of her. She gets there, and it's clear from the look on his face that he is doing something that is giving him pleasure and is turning him on in some way, but she doesn't know what the thing is that he's going to want. And she is terrified. These people have power of life and death over all of these women, not literally to kill them with their bare hands, but one word identifying the person in this hierarchy as a traitor of some kind, and it's all over. She's terrified. And he says, "There's something that I want to do with you." And she's more terrified. She knows she's going to have to say yes. There will be no choice because there is no choice in this society. And he produces a box of the game of Scrabble. What he wants to do is play Scrabble with her. Again, the game of Scrabble never really feels the same after you've read about it in The Handmaid's Tale. It becomes the site of a form of complicity between them because this absolutely is not allowed. The handmaid and the commander do not play Scrabble together. It's both innocent and profoundly not innocent. And it's clearly intended by the commander as a sort of gateway drug or an entry drug into something else. And indeed, that's what it turns out to be. As Offred discovers after a certain point, all he is doing is the familiar thing that she remembers from her past, which is basically saying, "My wife doesn't understand me. I want to play Scrabble." But before long, he's saying to her, and also, actually, here's some makeup from the past. Makeup is outlawed in this society. Could you maybe dress up a bit, put on a bit of lipstick? And from there, we quite quickly get to, I want to take you out to a place that you will not know anything about. It's a private club for men like me to parade women like you. From Scrabble to the worst nightclub in the world. There is in this world a ritual called particicution. And particicution is what happens when a political enemy of the state is to be killed, but it's decided that the most efficient way to kill men who are enemies of the state is to tell a group of women that these men have been found guilty of rape, and then to throw them to this group of women to be kicked and beaten to death. And that is called particicution, a participatory execution. And a particicution is described in this book. And again, it has echoes of things that are familiar. It sounds a bit like, before it actually happens, the scene at the end of Shirley Jackson's terrifying short story, The Lottery, in which a group of people in a small American town take part in what is clearly a form of ritual sacrifice, where suddenly what is familiar and recognizable social codes of behavior leads to death, violent death. It's also, Atwood says at the end of the book, based on something that she was dimly aware of when she was writing it, which was a Canadian exercise regime, a sort of gym workout, which was called participation and action. This is particicution. It's a kind of workout. And it's also something from your worst nightmares, for the women as well as for the man. It is an act of unimaginable brutality. The club that Offred is taken to by the commander is a kind of Playboy club. So there are women there dressed in bunny outfits from the previous time, from the earlier time. Some of these costumes have been rescued, and the women are meant to dress as these creatures from the past. This is a kind of Playboy club. The women are simply paraded around. And at the same time, it's like a nightclub in a death camp. It's also like something from the zone of interest. Everything about the place reeks of death, the possibility of death. Many of the women are being worked to death in this place. And one of the women in this club says, "This is terrible, but everywhere else is worse." And none of us have got that long left. It's the familiar and the deeply unfamiliar all at the same time. Is it prophetic? Is this combination of what was known even in 1985 extrapolated through some future event to a future in which it all comes together to produce the nightmare? Is it prophetic? So The Handmaid's Tale is often held up as a prophetic book in the time, the nearly 40 years now since it was published. And I'm not thinking here of the TV series. I'm not talking about the TV series, so it's quite hard to get the visuals of that out of your head. I'm talking about the book, which is old now. It's more than a generation old. But over those 40 years, it comes up a lot as a book that seemed to foresee something that was happening in America and in the wider world as well. When Roe versus Wade was repealed almost exactly 2 years ago this week, there was a lot of talk about The Handmaid's Tale, a turning back to a past that many people thought had been left behind, the removal of choice from women by a society that seemed to be dominated by a politics of a certain form of evangelical Christian religion, a politics in which certain kinds of male power were being exercised through institutions that excluded women, to create a world which might end up being a world that was a horrible reminder of perhaps even quite a distant past. And all those things are true, but I don't think you can say that Roe versus Wade is, in its repeal, an event that creates the conditions for Gilead. Because the other thing to be said about the politics of that of 2 years ago and of now is that it's still part of a recognizable and continuous story that does go back 50 or more years. The repeal of Roe versus Wade is part of a recognizable story that begins with Roe versus Wade 50 years earlier. The role of the Supreme Court, the role of democratic politics in America. We are now in a time where, because of a decision of the Supreme Court, the politics of abortion has been thrown back to the states, the individual states in the United States, and very, very different outcomes are happening in different places. It's also been politicized as a weapon in democratic elections. It may turn out to be the decisive feature of the presidential election of 2024. There's nothing foreordained or preordained about how the repeal of Roe versus Wade leads to an outcome, a social or a political or an economic outcome, in which women end up as they end up in Gilead. I'm not saying it's impossible, but we're definitely not there yet. This is still a recognizable politics where there is continuity with the past. And the point about Gilead is that the past is a foreign country from which people have been forcibly removed. Everybody has been forcibly removed, men as well as women. The whole society has been turned on its head. And that hasn't happened yet. What I think feels more prophetic in a way about this book over the last 40 years is the demography, the demographic underpinning of this story, because something that certainly has accelerated over that period in many societies, less so the United States, though in parts of the United States, more so actually in other developed societies like Japan, South Korea, the societies of Southern Europe, Spain, Greece, Italy, is rapidly declining birth rates, way, way below the replacement level. In South Korea, to the point where in 50 years' time, 100 years' time, the South Korean population may have halved or more than halved. And in which, in a place like South Korea, there are movements that are explicitly trying to create for women the possibility of choosing to opt out of the whole package that would in the past have been associated with a woman's reproductive role. So in South Korea, there is now what is called the 4B movement, in which young women are pledging to renounce, to choose to renounce the 4 things that traditionally made up a woman's role. They will not have children. They will not get married. They will not engage in sexual acts with men. They will not even go on dates. Men are out of this picture. Women are choosing to live lives which reject that past. And in some of these societies, it is creating the beginnings of a panic on the part of or on behalf of men. And there are some societies in the world, of which India is the preeminent example, China to a lesser extent. In India, there are many more men, young men, than there are women because of selective abortion, the abortion of female fetuses, creating a huge surplus, tens of millions of extra men. Two things happening at the same time, not yet in India, dramatically falling birth rates, but in other places, dramatically falling birth rates, and the possibility of a surplus of men. At one point, one of the characters, the commander, in the Society of the Handmaid's Tale in Gilead, explains to Offred, to his handmaid, that the reason all of this had to happen was someone had to do something, not about the women, but about the men. That is, these societies were turning into societies where there were men with nothing to do. There were men with no purpose and no justification, men who had been excluded. And these men needed a role, so a role is created for them by creating a grotesque, patriarchal society built around the politics of biology and reproduction. It's a big leap from there being men with nothing to do to Gilead. But that's partly how it happens. In this society's own account of its origin story, something had to be done for the men. And we're nowhere near that yet, but there are hints, there are suggestions of a politics that goes way beyond the repeal of Roe versus Wade, a politics which is aggressively about the need for human reproduction, built on a panic, partly a racial panic about replacement, in which white women in particular are thought not to be having enough children. There is a politics of this in the United States. This is more Elon Musk than it is Donald Trump. Donald Trump has recognized if he wants to be president, he has to tread very, very carefully around Roe versus Wade. But Elon Musk, who has, I think, 11 children himself, believes that the future of the human race depends on there being much more reproduction, and much more reproduction effectively by the elite members of the human race. And it's, though Musk doesn't do it himself, some of his followers explicitly cash that out in racial terms. That is going on now. And yet the difference between now and the imagined 2015 or even 2024 of Gilead is that we are in the future relative to 1985. So what's so distinctive about Gilead is that it is a future that is not the future, it is the past. It is a society, among other things, that has turned its back on technology. So another dystopian fiction that is echoed in The Handmaid's Tale is Samuel Butler's classic late 19th century novel Erewhon, which is the book in which a society is discovered that has declared war on machinery, turned its back on technological progress. And Gilead is like that too. The machines in Gilead are really retro. The cars are retro. Everything about this society feels retrogressive. The domestic labor is very physical. It is very manual. There are no gizmos and gadgets. There are walls and boys with guns and men with big 1950s style cars. And the clothing and the atmosphere all reeks of the past. At one point, Offred says of this society that she remembers, of course she remembers, that it used to be possible when a woman was pregnant to discover the sex of the baby. But those machines have been outlawed. Ultrasound has been banned in this society. It is a turning back to an age of biology, a world in which physical limits have been re-established, of physical violence. People are kicked to death in this world. We don't live in that world. We live in the world of 40 years of technological acceleration. It's nothing like Gilead, not even in Iran, not even in Afghanistan. The technology is everywhere. And that means, I think, that if there is going to be a massive panic about declining birth rates, there are three possibilities here. I mean, this is putting it a bit crudely, but there are basically three possibilities if the fear takes hold that human beings, and by human beings, the fear will be channeled against women are not having enough children. And that societies, therefore, are effectively committing a form of suicide. And that's the panic in Gilead. This is a society which will kill itself unless this small group of people assert their authority over it and recreate this hierarchy. If that panic takes hold, there are three possibilities, one of which is the Gilead possibility, which is compulsory reproduction in one form or another. It doesn't have to be this exact form, but if human beings stop having children, one thing that human societies might do is to start to compel human beings to have children, not just to incentivize them, as happens in many societies, including South Korea, where there are cash bonuses. It's never enough to try and tempt particularly women to re-enter the reproductive economy. Not just incentives, but compulsion. That has to be a real possibility that might happen, and that would be a nightmare. That is the dystopia. The second route for these societies is immigration. If there aren't enough people, you can import people. You can open your borders. There are still many parts of the world in which plenty of children are being born. These are often poorer parts of the world. If richer societies need more human beings, we're not running out of human beings, but it does require a politics of openness to people from other cultures, other societies. And that's hard. We know that's hard. And in places like South Korea, like Japan, the politics of that are almost impossible. These are not societies that are comfortable with opening themselves up to people from other places. It's true in Southern Europe, perhaps to a lesser extent, but the politics of immigration is toxic. And the idea that immigration is straightforwardly a solution to declining birth rates looks like a stretch. And then the third possibility is robots. If there aren't enough people, and people aren't going to be forced to have children, and societies are not going to open their borders to allow people from elsewhere, not just refugees, but voluntary migrants to come in, the third possibility is artificial people. Maybe we're on the cusp of being able to create workers and other productive individuals who are AIs or robots. In Japan, in South Korea, in other places, there is quite a lot of that going on too. A bet essentially on robotics to provide care in old people's homes, robotics to provide some of the grunt work that's needed for industry, robotics to do the labor in the absence of human beings. And then these societies might be able to sustain themselves for a long time. They will age. There will be many, many more old people. So there will need to be much, much more care. But if care can be done not by people, but by machines, this thing might take care of itself. There's Gilead, there's immigration, there's robotics. There's probably a lot of other things too, and combinations. But nonetheless, if you look at those three possibilities, it's not obvious to me at this point that the route we're heading towards is Gilead. And for some of that politics of fear around reproduction and replacement that comes, among other things, out of places like Silicon Valley, robotics probably is the bet. The bet here is on technology to provide the solution. Human beings will need to reproduce. So Elon Musk is very skeptical about AI. He wants the humans to make more humans. But there are plenty of other people in Silicon Valley who think that the age of humans making more humans may be done anyway. And this is the age now to properly embrace the possibility of post-human or hybrid human or non-human futures in which human flourishing is still possible, but we don't need to do it by tying ourselves to the biology of reproduction. I have no idea which of these futures is going to happen. I have no idea what will decide which of these futures is going to happen. But the other thing I think to say about Gilead is that this is not just a place that emerges from existing trends. So it is made up of existing trends, and part of the terror of it is a society that is entirely recognizable as well as being completely unfamiliar. But something has to happen to get you to Gilead. Something has to happen politically, in the sense that a society like the United States only becomes Gilead if there is an armed takeover. There has to be a coup. There has to be a group, a sect, with an ideology and with the means, including the weapons and the people, to take over the state. You don't necessarily need a lot of them. Lenin showed that. And they do it in part, it's hinted in the book, by creating a kind of false flag event in which there are assassinations, there is a terrible terrorist incident that is blamed on Islamic terrorists, and that allows the suspension of the constitution, the takeover of the state, and then these people take charge. But it requires the other events as well. Whatever these things are that have happened, the nuclear accidents, the chemical warfare, the pesticides, the failures of the natural environment, the things that have destroyed the capacity of human beings to live what had until that point been the familiar rhythms of a natural existence, within which then human beings can exercise a choice. They can opt out of those rhythms of natural existence. But something happens to radically interrupt that rhythm, and that's the thing that creates the opportunity. And the thing that is hard to imagine from now is a future after an event like that. But it would also be a false kind of optimism to say, if you extrapolate from the trends of now through those possibilities that I described, it's hard to see that the trends of now lead to Gilead, because Gilead is not the result of a series of trends. It is not the result of a demographic progression towards a society in which patriarchy of the most brutal kind reasserts itself. Gilead is what happens when those trends collide with catastrophe. And then when catastrophe happens, anything is possible. And the implication here is that the catastrophe could be anything. It could be war. It could be some horrific accident of some kind, some accidental leak of something into the atmosphere, into the natural world that radically interferes with how human beings are able to live, that interferes with our biology. It could be anything. It hasn't happened yet. But that's the point of The Handmaid's Tale. It hasn't happened yet. We're well beyond 2015. It still hasn't happened. In Atwood's imagining, it has already happened by 2015. But you would have to be very optimistic to think that it could never happen. And if the thing that hasn't happened yet does happen, whatever that thing is, then indeed anything is possible, including Gilead. We are now going to pause this series about the great political fictions. There are still a few more to come, including novels by Alan Hollinghurst and Curtis Sittenfeld, but there is a general election going on at the moment in the UK, and we are going to do a short series about historic British general elections, the ideas behind them, and the ways that they changed British politics. We're starting with the election of 1906. We're going to finish with the election of 2019, and we will talk all the way through about the election of 2024. If you sign up to PPF Plus by going to ppfideas.com, you will get a bonus episode for the fiction series, my attempt to answer your questions, but also a bonus episode for the election series, the election of 1924, in some ways the most interesting election of them all. You can also sign up now by following the link in our show description to get our free fortnightly newsletter, and the new edition is out tomorrow. That is going to accompany the last 4 episodes in this series. So it'll be a guide to the last 4 books I've been talking about: Mother Courage, Atlas Shrugged, Midnight's Children, and The Handmaid's Tale. And as always, follow us on Twitter at PPF Ideas to find out everything that's going on with this podcast. But next time, it's the election of 1906. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.